So when the global crisis hit in late 2008, Oxfam researchers sat down and said, okay, we want to actually see how this global shock plays out in the lives of poor people. So we put the word out around Oxfam, and we got about 12 countries in the end who were interested in doing some national level research. And we set up a variety of different approaches. We did focus groups, we did interviews, we talked to our partners, and we did a kind of review of the literature that was out there in terms of the economic impact and social impact of previous crises. We put all that together to try and understand how this crisis actually gets down to real people's lives. What we saw was a staggered impact, phases of impact. So the first impact was on any country that had big level of financial integration, was very badly affected by the drying up of capital flows. Countries that were very dependent on trade suddenly saw, for example, the price of copper or oil go down very quickly. And then there was a kind of knock-on effect on jobs. First of all, in the informal sector, if women working in garment factories suddenly lost orders because of the recession in the US or Europe, they lost their jobs, or they went on to short-term working or more precarious kinds of contract. And then a knock-on effect on the informal economy. All those people who sell lunches on the streets to workers in factories suddenly found that the workers weren't buying lunch anymore. So you had a knock-on effect right through to the really quite poor parts of the economy. An impact on women in particular. One of the things we did, which virtually no one else did, was look at the gender impact of the crisis, and found that women's jobs were becoming more precarious. Women were the first to lose jobs in the factories, and their role as an unpaid worker in the family and in the home was getting squeezed by all these other pressures that were piling on top. Some things didn't occur. We didn't see a big fall in remittances from migrant workers. They kept sending money home, even though it was getting very difficult. But then we saw an effect, sort of slower, longer-term effect on governments. So governments started to lose revenue because they were no longer getting the big taxes from trade, and they started to open what we call a big fiscal hole. So across the low-income countries, many of them in Africa, there is a $65 billion fiscal hole being caused by the sudden drop of revenues coming from the crisis. Now that's really important because that's what funds hospitals, schools, feeding programs, social protection, all sorts of social schemes depend on government spending, and suddenly the governments have had the rug pulled out from under them. Aid has not fallen very fast, but we're worried that it will fall as the pressure mounts on the aid donating countries, but aid certainly hasn't filled that fiscal hole. So when you look at the extra money that's come to the poorest countries, aid has only filled about 13% of that hole. The rest of that money is coming from cuts, or is coming from governments having to raise money on the domestic market from local people, and they have to pay higher interest rates for that. So we're worried that there'll be a domestic debt crisis down the line. But we found some good news too. The word which captures a lot of what we found is resilience. What we found is that people managed to keep their kids in school. They didn't leave the cities and go back to the villages as they've done in previous crises. And we looked at how this resilience was actually formed. And the first source of this resilience is actually your friends and family, the communities you live in. People had social networks, and the social networks look out for each other. So one of the lessons is just how important this social capital is in a crisis. But the economic structures of the country matter as well. If the whole country is dependent on copper, like Zambia, and the price of copper collapses, then suddenly the whole country is in serious trouble. So if a country is diversified, if a country has a state banking sector, many countries have sold off all their banks to foreign banks, and they all were swamped by the crisis. Countries like Brazil, which still have state banks, were able to use those banks to put money into the economy and to actually do the kind of reflation Keynesian thing that people have been doing in the rich countries as well. The role of the state. Countries which had a good, effective state system, which had good systems of pension, of social protection, those kind of cash transfer payments, were able to get money quickly into the hands of poor people and really cushion the effect of the crisis. So this really drove home the importance of an effective state. What have we learned from all this? Well, I think one of the lessons is that it's really hard to introduce new stuff, to start new programs in the middle of a meltdown, in the middle of a crisis. So the countries that did better were the ones that had more resilient systems going into the crisis, the ones that had good social protection systems, the ones that had free health and education. So people didn't cut health and education in order to save money because it was free. Countries with effective systems for getting money into the hands of the poor, those were the ones that did better. I think what happens at a sort of more micro level is that the families run down their capital, they sell off assets, they maybe eat less to get through the crisis, and so what you need to do after a crisis is replenish those sources of resilience as fast as possible. So act before the crisis hits and after the crisis hits, so that the impact of the crisis itself is not as bad. Real-time data, as I say, we talked to 2,500 people in 12 countries. We were one of the few organisations that actually did this. There's an extraordinary gap in terms of actually knowing what's happening in real time. All the statistics you read about in the papers are 2 years old. So when a crisis is hitting, international organisations actually have no idea what's happening to poverty, what's happening to hunger. Everything has this terrible delay. With the exception of famine, you have early warning systems for famine. We need early warning systems for a much wider range of issues. So I think everybody now accepts that we need to sort out real-time, constant monitoring if we're actually going to be able to react in time to these kind of sudden shocks. And we expect more shocks and deeper shocks as time goes on, with climate change, with financial markets not really being tamed by this, food prices are going back up again. There's all sorts of reasons to expect that there will be more shocks like this one. Think about gender. You know, the effect is different on women and men, and the response is different on women, for women and men. So, for example, many women lost their jobs in factories. Governments responded by putting money into construction projects like road building or new dams. But actually, it's men that get those jobs. So women were losing their jobs, and the government was responding by creating jobs for men. Not intentionally, just because they weren't thinking about the gender impact and the gender response. Finally, we may think the crisis is over, we have our own problems to deal with in terms of government debt. There is this huge fiscal hole. Aid is nowhere near filling that hole. It would be an outrage if the poorest countries had to cut health and education to mop up the damage of a crisis that they did not create.